The second decade of the 20th century didn't have a catchy nickname like many of the others, but it was far from boring and ordinary. The 1910s brought the death and devastation of World War I and the Spanish influenza pandemic, but it also saw the rise of the motion picture industry, the victory of the women's suffrage movement, and significant technological advances in communication and transportation. American culture in the tens saw great changes as the nation and the world transitioned from the more sedate Victorian era to what was hailed as the modern age. In this episode of Back in the Day, we will look at some of the trends and events that defined the decade. Fashions in the 1910s were largely a continuation of what became popular in the previous decade. The iconic Gibson girl image, created by artist Charles Gibson in pen and ink illustrations from the 1890s until after World War I, was considered the personification of the ideal modern woman. She had a narrow-waisted hourglass figure, confined by a very restricting corset, high-volume poofy hairstyles, long skirts, puffed sleeve blouses with high collars, and huge hats with feathers and other decoration. The Gibson girl was seen to enjoy outside sports such as cycling, tennis, and horseback riding. She was interested in the arts and moved easily in modern society. It should be noted that the women depicted in Gibson's drawings were exclusively white, a fact that he fiercely defended with racist rhetoric when challenged. The Gibson girl motif faded late in the decade to be soon replaced by the iconic flapper of the 1920s. For men, boxy Victorian suits gave way to a lighter, slimmer look, with high, stiff collars worn with ankle or high-top boots. For the head, bowlers and boaters were the norm. Popular fabrics were wool and flannel in muted colors such as charcoal and brown. Pocket watches, walking sticks, and gloves were popular accessories. For casual wear, it was hard to see a difference. Even while engaged in casual activities, men still wore dress shirt, trousers and tie, with or without a hat. Popular music in the early years of the decade carried over from the last. Ragtime piano and nostalgic parlor songs by Billy Murray, Sophie Tucker, and Al Jolson.
Captain Jinks one night on Broadway, all alone, read the news about the wireless telephone. Pretty soon his thoughts began to stray, over 7,000 miles away. Then he went and drew a whole month's pay to phone and say.
However, there was a new sound emerging to compete with the music of the old days. By 1910, this unique blend of African, European, and American sounds had settled into New Orleans and was making its way north. By 1914, Freddie Keppert and his Creole band were touring the United States and even performing in Canada. The first commercial recording of jazz music occurred in 1917, when the original Dixieland Jazz Band recorded Livery Stable Blues. The popularity of jazz never faded and is still going strong today. The airplane was still a novelty in the 1910s. In air shows across the country, huge crowds showed up to see pilots and their fragile craft compete to see who could fly the highest, the fastest, and the furthest. Barnstormers hopped from one cornfield to the next, dazzling locals with daredevil stunts. Aircraft technology increased greatly in the decade. In 1910, the state-of-the-art plane was the Wright Model B, a fragile craft that carried a pilot and perhaps one daring or crazy passenger. By 1915, planes were sturdier and more powerful. They also proved to be useful in war. Aircraft were used in Europe to locate enemy trenches, drop bombs, shoot other aircraft, and attack forces on the ground. By the end of the decade, planes got bigger. In 1919, what could be called the first airliner, the Farman Goliath, took to the skies. It could carry 15 passengers and flew one of the first international routes from London to Paris. The motion picture industry made great strides during the decade. For one thing, movie makers moved west. In the early days, the industry was monopolized by Thomas Edison, his patents, and his Motion Picture Patents Company, which effectively banned independent filmmakers from the market. Many of these moved their operations to the Los Angeles area to take advantage of the agreeable climate and to put some distance between them and Edison's lawyers. Although the MPPC was put out of business by an antitrust suit in 1915, the movie company stayed, and in time Hollywood became the entertainment capital of the world. Motion pictures got a lot more popular in this decade. By 1916, 25 million people a day were at the movies. In 1910, films were viewed in small theaters called Nickelodeons, where the price of admission was, you guessed it, 5 cents. By the end of the decade, moviegoers were seated in lavishly decorated movie palaces, such as the Strand Theater in New York. What were people watching on the movie screens of the tens? In 1910, Selig Polyscope Company produced the first Wizard of Oz movie. A far cry from the famous 1939 version, this one is only loosely based on the books. For example, the Scarecrow is the one from Dorothy's farm who has somehow come to life. At the end, he is crowned King of Oz, just before the wizard floats away in his balloon. In 1915, the highly controversial Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith, demonstrated state-of-the-art technology and innovative technique. The 12-reel film runs more than 3 hours, quite unusual for the time. However, its racist, white supremacist narrative was seen as problematic even before its release, and today it remains one of the most controversial films ever produced. Comedies were also quite popular, and one of the best known and most popular comic actor was Charlie Chaplin. Born in London to an absent father and mentally ill mother, Chaplin came to America at the age of 19 as an employee of music hall impresario Fred Carno. By 1914, he was widely known as a player in the highly successful Keystone films. By the end of the decade, Chaplin was one of the highest-paid actors in America. Although his later life was marked with controversy, his work is still held in high regard today. There were a lot more cars on the road in the 1910s, and prices were coming down, which meant that more people could afford to buy one. The Ford Model T, considered by many to be a prime example of a mid-priced car, still cost almost $1,000 in 1910, about $32,000 today. By the end of the decade, the price had dropped to about $500, the equivalent of less than $9,000 today. However, there were cheaper options available. For $125, you could buy the Smith Flyer, a small wooden frame car with 5 wheels. The engine drove the 5th wheel and back. Its single cylinder put out about 1 horsepower, enough to push the car to a top speed of about 20 miles per hour. At the high end of the market, in 1915, you could buy a Pierce Arrow 66 for about $7,000. Its massive 6-cylinder engine put out 100 horsepower, and you could get the car up to 80 miles an hour, much too fast for the primitive roads of the time. If that was a bit outside your budget, the Oldsmobile Limited could be had for just $4,000. What did people buy in the 10s? For one thing, the timeless and iconic Oreo cookie made its debut in 1912. Nabisco brought the tasty treat to market to compete with Hydrox, a similar product that was introduced 4 years earlier. It was a competition that Oreo won, since Hydrox is a rarely found shadow of its former self. And what better drink to enjoy those cookies with than the equally timeless and iconic Coca-Cola? It seems that some things never change, except for the price. Music was big back then, and the number one name in phonographs was Edison. I guess that makes sense, since he invented the thing. Vice President Marshall famously remarked that what this country needs is a really good 5-cent cigar. I don't know how good they were, but there were several to choose from. Laxative tablets seem to have been popular among children. Actually, I think this girl has had a little too much of something. And speaking of kids, there were those special moments when having a beer with your grandpa. Breakfast cereals were becoming popular in the tens. Can you think of a more credible mascot for selling cornflakes than George Washington? And at least in large cities, dial telephones and long distance service were the latest and greatest tech. In the early 20th century, developers across the country convinced streetcar companies to extend their lines beyond the cities and into the surrounding countryside. This allowed two things to happen. Residential and commercial developments called streetcar suburbs sprang up along the trolley line, and leisure destinations, often called trolley parks, were built at the end of the line. In the beginning, these parks featured picnic areas and pavilions for music and dancing. Over time, more attractions were added, and by 1910 had become full-fledged amusement parks. Most of these parks faded away by the 30s, but some, like New York's famed Coney Island, are still going strong today. I just look back at life in the towns as much as I enjoyed putting it together. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. When you have a chance, visit the BygoneLife website at BygoneLife.com. It's like taking a trip back in time.